Hey, good morning. It's Patricia Murphy. It's Tuesday. This is Seattle Now. A lot of people objected when the Navy proposed expanding the number of areas in Washington state parks that it could use to train Navy SEALs. Now, a Superior Court judge has ruled they never had the right permission to train there in the first place. Seattle Times reporter Hal Bernton is here to explain. But first, let's get you caught up. King County's health officer says COVID transmission is picking up again and now has crossed into what the CDC calls medium levels. Dr. Jeff Duchin says the rise in cases was not unexpected and people should see this as a yellow traffic light. There'll be no new restrictions for now. The transmission level increased when the county saw more than 200 new cases per 100,000 residents over 7 days. Meanwhile, University of Washington researchers have developed a new kind of COVID-19 vaccine. The difference is it doesn't require ultra-cold storage like the current mRNA vaccines do. They say that could help get the vaccine distributed more easily around the world, especially in poorer nations. The vaccine just cleared a phase 3 trial that showed it to be safe and effective. Next up, the company that's developing the vaccine will seek to have it authorized to be used in South Korea. And Canada is allowing unvaccinated children aged 5 to 11 in with no COVID test as long as they're traveling with a fully vaccinated adult. Pre-entry tests will still be needed for partially vaccinated or unvaccinated travelers over 12. Children under 5 don't currently require a COVID-19 test to enter Canada, but all travelers still need to wear a mask and use the Arrive Can app to upload vaccination documents 72 hours prior to crossing. About 10 years ago, Alan Rosado was working as a kayak guide on Orcas Island. One day, he was leading an overnight tour on Jones Island, a small state park west of Deer Harbor.
As we arrived to the island, there was a big Navy vessel anchored off the south end of the island. And we saw guys running around in Zodiacs off of the boat and doing exercises.
Alan thought, no big deal, just a little out of place. Later that evening, the Navy had stopped its training. The kayakers set up their tents and went to bed. And then
someone raps on my tent and says, "What's going on?" And I come out of the tent to see the Zodiacs zipping around and a big spotlight coming off of the ship, or a couple spotlights, scanning the shoreline and all the campsites. And the Zodiacs then land on the shore and the guys go running off into the woods. And as soon as they're off in the woods, all the lights shut off and it just kind of goes silent again and back to nature.
They managed to go back to bed, a little freaked out. When they woke up in the morning, the ship was gone. Alan says he came away from it with a minor level of PTSD, and it led him to get involved with a group called Not in Our Parks that wants to keep the military from using state lands for training.
It really hit me that this is just not an appropriate place for the military to be. It's a place where, just individuals go to have an experience with nature. And regardless of whether they're hiding in the forest and you're never knowing they're there, it's just really disconcerting to know that's going on.
That feeling is the so-called creep factor that State Superior Court Judge James Dixon included in his ruling when earlier this month he determined the Navy never had proper permission to train in state parks. But the Navy says it needs to train there and wants to up the number of coastal state parks it uses from 5 to 29. Seattle Times reporter Hal Bernton says the military says it needs these parks for the diverse terrain they offer. We reached him while on a trip to Los Angeles.
They said that the current training outside the state parks was too limited and failed to provide enough diverse training locations or physical environment features or areas that were just way unfamiliar to the trainees to offer the best training. So they thought that this was really important for them, something that was viewed very, very skeptically by the critics who said there are plenty of other places they could train. And under the old permit, park officials were supposed to get at least 3 days' notice before training, and the Navy was supposed to avoid, if reasonably possible, any interference with the use of these sites by the public.
Yeah. The judge who made the ruling in this case cited the so-called creep factor. Let's talk about that a little bit. What did they mean?
Well, he was talking about the fact that the whole idea is that this is surveillance, that they will be basically fade into the background, that you won't see them, but that there will be some surveillance observation, stealth observation, while people are in the park. Even though they would typically come ashore at night, they would stay for a period of more than 24 hours. And that the judge, what he said is, over the past few days, this court has spent some time trying to articulate another definition or phrase that might adequately describe the emotional impact, something other than creep factor, because it's a long ways from a legal term, but I can't find one. It is creepy. That's Judge James Dixon, as he issued basically a verbal decision from the bench saying that he felt that this had not been properly analyzed by the parks in terms of whether that violated state environmental law.
You know, this gets at something, Hal, that I think about sometimes, and I'm sure as a military reporter, you've thought about it too, about what it means to have a military and having to train, right? The things the military does are very real, and sometimes it's uncomfortable for people to be aware or confronted by that. And that seems to be a part of this argument as well.
Well, I think it's the where. Like, yes, when training is conducted at Fort Lewis and their heavy artillery barrages that are making all kinds of noise and sound that harasses neighbors, it's happening on that military installation. But here, they're trying to operate at state parks, which even though some of them may have previously been forts, have been set aside by our state legislature for very different purposes, not for military exercises. I think that is really at the heart of what the judge is calling into question and saying that it's not according to law. And it's also what's really bothering a lot of critics. That said, there is broader tension now in our region over the military's very big footprint here, the ways in which they train, and the fact that many people in the region think there need to be more accommodations. One big battle we have is over the growlers that are flying all the time in training missions over Whidbey Island and also out over the Olympic Peninsula, and the noise that they generate. That's been an ongoing point of contention, controversy, and also legal battles as well.
Yes, I have had plenty of camping trips, Hal, ruined at Deception Pass by growlers flying for the entire time. That's for sure. That being said, are there other places that the military could train, Hal?
Boy, the governor of Alaska sure thinks so. After he heard about the judge's ruling, he wrote a letter to the Navy and said, "You guys are welcome here. We have so many coastlines. You want tough currents? We got them. You want remote areas? We got them. You want rugged coastlines?" And it was very much like an invitation. And of course, the Navy does do some training in Alaska. Whether they could do more or whether perhaps there are expenses there that aren't in their budget or the areas are too remote, I don't know. But that was certainly an open invitation. And then there's, of course, lots of people who are feeling like there are other places in Washington that the Navy has long trained their SEALs and that they should be adequate. It is worth noting that the old permits expired in 2020, and since then the Navy has not been allowed to train at any state parks because the new permits have not been issued. Somehow they have found a way to train their SEALs without the state parks. They still say very much that they want the state parks as part of that training, but obviously they have continued to conduct exercises for the SEALs in Washington state, but outside of the state parks.
Hal, let's talk a little bit about the hundreds of public comments that were elicited over this decision. What did you see and what seemed to be the main issue for people?
People were really concerned about the militarization of the state parks, that they felt it wasn't an appropriate use of the state parks. And the idea that the State Park Commission would grant that really was serious point of concern there were, as you said, hundreds of letters of protest. And there was also concern about possibly running into some of the SEAL training teams. They will be carrying simulated weapons and such. The Navy says that they're really great. They're like ghosts that fade into the background that won't be seen. But that certainly didn't allay a lot of people's concerns and fears. And fundamentally, that this was part of a militarization of state parks that shouldn't be happening.
I would imagine it would be quite scary to be camping or out recreating somewhere and catching a glimpse of a military exercise you were unaware that was taking place around you. Okay, so what happens next? I am guessing the Navy is going to appeal this.
We really don't know, and the primary defendant is the State Parks and Recreation Commission. And where we are now is the judge said, here's my verbal ruling from the bench. And they said to the plaintiffs, the judge said, here's my ruling from the bench, my verbal ruling. And he said to the plaintiffs that he wants them to draft up a decision document, a ruling that would implement his verbal bench ruling. And that should be circulated among all the different parties involved in this lawsuit. There should be some consensus reached. Then that should be submitted. And if he thinks it's all good, he will sign it. So that's how this is going forward. He's not actually issuing a written ruling. He's asked the plaintiffs to develop it. So I checked last week and it was still being circulated. And so until that's actually finalized and the judge signs it, there's no really decision point for the Parks Commission to appeal it. And when I checked with them last week, they said there's no real news and checked for updates. So I guess we don't know what will happen in the aftermath of this ruling at this point.
And the Navy already has a significant portion of coastline that it can work with, right?
It does have its own coastline. It also has some private areas that apparently it's been able to use. So there are other places, yes.
Okay. Seattle Times reporter Hal Bernton, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much today to Chawanzi from Seattle, Jason from Seattle, and Grace from Seattle. They make KUOW's Seattle Now possible. Thanks for listening. Caroline Chamberlain Gomez produced today's show. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.